In this special crossover episode of Well, Since You Asked Me and I Take Your Point, John and I are teaming up to talk music, independence, and the industry that keeps evolving. Our guest, Marko Nobles, takes us behind the scenes of the independent music world, from the power of community to the challenges artists face in the digital age. Let's get into it.
This is the annual Soul Train Tribute. This year, our Soul Train Tribute is to the one and only Luther Vandross.
Marko, thank you so much for joining us today. Marko, aka The Architect. We are honored to have you on the podcast today. And we wanted to start off a little bit about you just taking us through your journey and telling us a little bit about where you are, what brought you into this space. And
it's a loaded question, and I know we have limited time because it's a lot in terms of what brought me into this. So I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So radio was a creation as a regular radio show, and when I started doing the show, some 30 plus years ago, I wanted to do more than just regular radio, hey, we're going to give a shout out to so-and-so, we're going to do this giveaway. And I kind of stumbled into the world of independent music. And so that I decided would be the niche to showcase more independent music and independent artists that don't get the opportunity to be heard on radio regularly. That, went on for a number of years, and I quickly realized that there was a lot of independent music out there that I wasn't aware of and that wasn't getting, played regularly and that needed an outlet. So I continued to showcase independent music, independent artists, got into producing events featuring independent artists, concerts and the like, and then said, you know what, there's enough material to really do 24 hours and create my own radio station, which is something I always wanted to do. And I figured the easiest way of entry to do that was created on the internet. So I did that, but incorporating some of the music that people recognize and artists that they recognize that have an independent sensibility. So folks like Jill Scott or Mos Def or, Talib Kweli or Common or The Roots, those types of folks that have a different type of sensibility in terms of almost independent do-it-yourself type, or come from labels that are like subsidiaries of larger labels but weren't truly independent. I was able to mix them in with the independent artists, and that's a short version of how I got to where I am now.
Thanks for that, Marko. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. For clarity's sake, let's define what independent artists are and how, when you think about an independent artist, what are the metrics that you use in order to label that artist independent?
For me, an independent artist is an artist that has no affiliation with any of the quote-unquote major labels. This was particularly important when I first got into this journey because music was different at that time. You still had a record business with the major labels, the Sonys, the Warner Brothers, Elektra's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have that as much anymore. And you see that, I started to see that shift a few years ago when I had a conversation with Celicia Thompson, who is the manager and sister of Selena Johnson, who is a very popular artist. People might know her most for songs she did with Kanye West, and she's had a few hits on her own. She was onto a major label and then started releasing stuff independently without the benefit of label, funding it all herself, doing it, all on her own. And I had the conversation with her sister Celicia, or Dr. Celicia, and I said, technically she's independent, but I don't treat her as an independent artist as much because she had the benefit of the major label support that helped get her name out there. While I appreciate Selena Johnson as an artist because she's amazing and we support her and we've interviewed her and all of those things and always looking for ways to work with her, there is a line that I draw for those who have had the benefit of the major label push and support versus those who have done it all on their own. In essence, their CDs, pressed up their CDs, sold their CDs out of their own briefcase, trunk of their car, what have you, show to show, all of that, building their own following for shows, working their way through the process to get to the point where they can truly live off of their music and off of their art.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm always fascinated about, the late, would have been the mid 90s. I had the fortune of working with a couple independent artists. One was a gentleman who has gone on to have an extremely successful career. He signed with BET Jazz. This is a gentleman by the name of Marcus Johnson. We went to Howard together, and Marcus had a vision. He was in grad school and at law school at Georgetown, but he had the vision that he wanted to do it independently, and he wanted to a music businessman as well as a musician. And so we learned a lot in terms of pressing those CDs, driving up to Philly, driving up to New York, asking stores to carry, on consignment, and doing most of the groundwork that allowed him to have successful live shows and allowed him to still be doing what he is doing some 30 years later. And so I have a little bit of experience with that. Thing that always interests me when I look at artists like, when I think of independence, and there are a couple of artists here in Atlanta who have done a real good job in terms of breaking. Algebra Blessed is one. She came to the house about 30 years ago. The guy who managed her, a gentleman by the name of Jarrell Allen, is a good friend of mine. And, I remember having some type of showcase in Atlanta where he'd bring her on and she would do her singing and everything. And now she's having tremendous amounts of success. And then I'm reminded of Eric Roberson, who also came up through that channel, and all of us went to school together. But I think it's been independent since he started. I believe he was signed with Elektra, and I'd have to have Jerome keep me honest here. But I think Elektra gave him that start. But, you and I both know when you get caught in that machine and they don't want to support you or don't want to support you to the degree that you want them to, then it's more advantageous for you to do it on your own. And for you to say, okay, if I have a hardcore fan base who's going to support me and support my products when they come out, then I don't really need a major label to do the things that a major label can do. So how do you, when you're having those discussions with an artist who is looking to go the independent route, and it's a lot easier today than it was 20, 30 years ago, but with the advent of internet and with the explosion of internet, what are some of the pitfalls that you see?
Well, first of all, let me, I always say, and I always tell everybody who asks me about independent music and independent artists, Eric Roberson is the king of independent artists, the king of independent music, bar none. He is the king. Everybody else, falls in line under him.
We all went to school together at Howard. And ironically, all of us moved here in Atlanta at the same time. And Jarrell, the gentleman that I mentioned before, were managed, partnered with Eric. And so to see Eric's career, and he has a die-hard core fan base, and he's been extremely successful. And he had a vision for what he needed to do. I'm always interested with that New York, New Jersey, Philly connection, because that's what Eric was a part of, hooking up with the Roots, hooking up with Anthony Hamilton and all those guys. Do you see that if you're coming from more of a church, live instrumentation, performance background, that it's a lot easier for you to go the independent route versus someone who did not have that start?
And Marko, before you answer that, do you mind incorporating his initial question about some of the pitfalls for the independent artist?
I think the two questions are somewhat related, actually. I think in terms of pitfalls for artists who say they want to be independent or doing their own thing and they're going the independent route, they either try to sound like, or they really have their own voice. They want to make music they hear on the radio because that's what they want to be independent, but they want to be played on the radio. So as a result, they want to do what they're hearing, or they want to do what they think is going to get them mainstream play, but they may not be true to who they are. That's one factor. And then there are other factors that are much more technical, like, how are you mixing and mastering your music? How are you relating to quote unquote gatekeepers, the radio personalities, the record, shops? Their record stores are fewer and further between these days, but they are still important. How are you handling your shows? How are you building your team? So all of those things are very important, and understanding that all of them are necessary. Really, like you said, John, looking at it as a business, because it is. And it's hard because creatives are creatives and business people are business people. A lot of the times it's hard. It's hard to find. It takes a long time for the two to meet, so to speak, in the one person or the couple of people, because creatives are who they are, and it's hard for them to shift, but that is an important thing. I think one of the things that makes it harder, or maybe made it easier, some 20 years ago, was there was probably more community within the independent music scene then than there is now. It's kind of splintered off, and it's not so much that there was any real reason for it that I could see. It just is kind of splintered off. Times change, things change. Like when you think about, as Eric Roberson was coming through, and he mentioned all of those people. But I know that certainly here in New York, New Jersey, you had Eric Roberson would host Soul Village at SOBs, every month. And so you knew that was a gathering place for folks. You knew that a lot of people on the scene would be there. I hosted an event for a number of years that was similar to Soul Village at SOBs, but I did it in Harlem. So it allowed for people to have a gathering point, and build that community, and people can work together and see who else is out there that we should talk, and then be able to kind of meet, network, and pass information on to the next person and the next person. That is not as prevalent now as it was then. And, from that New York, New Jersey area, then it stretched to the DMV area. It stretched down to Atlanta, because when you talk about algebra, then you're also talking about Anthony David. You're talking about people throughout Atlanta, like Rhonda's last name is escaping me right now.
Rhonda, yeah, I know who you're talking. Rhonda Thomas.
Rhonda Thomas, thank you. Yeah, you're talking about Rhonda Thomas. You're talking about a whole host of folks. You're talking about even Avery Sunshine that came out of that community to go on and release all of her stuff independently, and now be a Grammy Award winning artist.
So we're familiar with some of the same people, and it's very interesting because I think when I go back to music, and I'm going to date myself here, and you'll appreciate this hopefully. I always tell people that I discovered Maxwell, or I brought Maxwell to DC, and so they look at me like I'm crazy. But one of the things that I did, and this would have been 96, 97, because I believe Maxwell came out around that time, and Urban Hang Suite came out, and it literally changed the game. Obviously, you had the neo soul movement that was sort of bubbling up on the surface. We were making that shift away from hip hop and features. And so we didn't have that real soulful sound since, you go back to the mid 80s, where you were having the bands like the Commodores, the bands like Earth, Wind and Fire, who were putting out these massive hits. And then you had neo soul hit the scene, and it sort of put the music industry on its head, because then you had what I call real musicianship. Strip away the samples. You had individuals that not only could produce quality music, but they could give great live performances. When I think about what you're talking about with respect to independent artists, you having those music showcases where individuals would rent out a restaurant and charge that fee at the door. Those would just do a 45-minute or an hour set. You think about DC, the DMV, going up to New Jersey, going up to New York, and those cliques that were together. I want to pick your brain about how have things changed when you think about the late 90s, 2000, maybe 2005-ish or so, where neo soul sort of went off. And then we've had this sort of dead period for about 10 years or so, to now real music is coming back into play, where you do have these artists that are harkening back to that neo soul thing.
I wouldn't say that the music went off, or the musicians went off. I think part of what happened is the lack of venue. And so therefore you don't get to see it as much. It's almost like when people say there's no good music on the radio. There is good music on the radio. It just may not be terrestrial radio. It may be internet radio. So it may be, you may have to listen to a rhythm and soul radio to hear what you want to hear. You may have to listen to Soul Grooves radio. You may want to have to listen to somebody like Pepper Thomas in Austin, Texas on KSEI, or Francis J, out of Dallas. So, it's just a matter of how do you get it. And when, the live music scene took certainly it's taking a hit. Like when I started doing my showcases, which was called The Rendezvous, I started them about 2003, 2004, maybe 2005, and did it up until 2016.
Okay.
Soon after that, and when I stopped, so when I started, there was no, like, the Apollo does an Apollo Music Cafe now, which features a lot of, independent artists, newer artists, etc. That wasn't in existence when I was doing The Rendezvous. And I did The Rendezvous because there was a lack of, one, venues. Venues were shutting down. A lot of New York City venues were shutting down, whether it was a Tramps or a Wetlands or whatever. You didn't have these venues. And there was, I'm from Harlem. When you think of Harlem, you think of jazz and great music, but you only think of jazz a lot of times. You don't think of, there's, great R&B, there's great soul, there's great jazz, there's great funk. So that for me was very important. So when I, stopped doing The Rendezvous, soon after Soul Village stopped. And then you still have the Apollo Music Cafe, but you don't have as many of the venues. And I want to say, even in Atlanta, Apache Cafe went through changes, and they went through, closing their one venue to open another venue, within a certain time. And it changes the dynamic, and people don't get to see music where they're used to seeing it. And then you have to kind of rebuild an audience to be able to come out and see and enjoy and discover, artists again. So I think that's probably more, not to change your question, but I think that's more of what you see of a lack of now with the internet. You see all these artists on YouTube that then get featured in on BET Awards as the new thing. That is music that, like a Duran Bernard, where somebody, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago would have hit all the spots, and he's already embraced by all of the artists that have been in that circle, from the Yazaras to, the Eric Robinsons to, all those types of people embrace Duran Bernard because he comes from that space.
I was having this conversation with Len a couple of weeks ago when I moved here in Atlanta. We had a couple of things that were going on. We had Noontime Studios, which was some Howard guys that decided that they were going to launch a boutique music label. And you had young artists come through like Tank, writers like Vontae Austin and Brian Michael Cox, who were just starting their career. And they were young kids who were at Clark Atlanta University. So they were college students. But I think about venues and events like Jack the Rapper. Individuals could come in and they could showcase and be discovered. What do you think about how that's shifted, and we no longer have those music festivals or music events that allow young creatives to come in and really get the eye and the ear of music executives?
Yeah, I think Jack the Rapper is sorely missed. There is still a version of the CMJ conference, but it's not the same. There is even South by Southwest, where Lynn and I met, is very different than, and I didn't get to experience, how South by Southwest really was. I only understand it from people telling me how it was when it started versus how it is now. That is much more corporate, which is kind of why I do the events I do within South by Southwest, to try to create that space of artists being able to be seen, be heard, and see each other, network with each other, and try to build those relationships that as they go on in their careers, they can, like a Tank or Brian Michael Cox, they can kind of be, later on in their careers, hey, remember when we, we're together in Austin? Because I'm sure even watching, Tank and his podcast, that seems to be a lot of where his guests come from, the people that he kind of came up with through this process, and there are a lot of that needs to happen, and a lot of it is corporate. when you talk about a South by Southwest going corporate, a lot of the reason that lose some of that organic feel when the corporate interests come in. And it's a weird catch-22 because you need the corporations because everything costs more. You need more money to do these things. You need the sponsorship, etc. But then you have to take care of those interests but then try to find a way to balance the organic nature of kind of building community through music and art and the purity of that to really allow, something that becomes ground shaking in a way because it is so pure, so connected and so important. So it's a real weird thing that what you need kind of kills off what you need.
That was one of the things that when I met you in South by Southwest, I think that I understood and I heard that it's even more difficult for people of color, right? Especially in Austin, that you need that corporate sponsorship. And if you don't have that and you may not have those resources, then it's going to be a little bit more challenging to be seen and heard. And those are some of the conversations that we had when we actually met during South by Southwest this year. Or last year.
Yeah, and that kind of permeates to the artists, right? Because then you have artists who now are either backed by a corporate interest or because they're utilizing the internet to get the views, the streams, the TikToks, all of that stuff to then get noticed by the corporate interest. So it's so much harder for an artist who is purely about the music and trying to put something out into the world that is organic, a lot of artists will get frustrated. And so therefore, what I've tried to be over this time and understand that I can be is a vessel, for artists to kind of come through whatever platforms that I have and can create, that they can come through and use these platforms as a stepping stone to get to that next.
I used to love to go into record stores and read the liner notes and see the credits in terms of who produced what, who played on what, because I love the creative process. And I believe it's Deep Tracks. I believe that's the show. But I love to hear the story of how an album is made and what it is that artist is thinking about when he or she is creating the album, how they decide the placement and sequences of the songs. When you see the evolution of major artists like an Usher, like a Megan Thee Stallion, like a Cardi B, who are all shifting to independent, moving away from major labels and deciding that they're going to set up their own boutiques, how is that impacting the other artists that are coming up who don't have the cachet that a Usher or Megan Thee Stallion or someone of that stature has?
I don't think in this day and age, I don't think it affects artists that much because it's all. This is the wrong term, but it's the best term I can come up with right now. It's all noise. The way that the industry is set up now, you have to be seen. You have to be heard. Traditional record labels don't help as much for you to get seen and heard. Almost everybody has access to the internet. And if you can create, a video and put it up on YouTube and get a little bit of traction, you can be seen and heard. I mean, where it certainly the Ushers, the Cardi B's, etc. They have the money to produce their own stuff, to press up all their CDs and everything, and get it into everywhere it needs to be sold, and maybe at a higher level than some of the independent artists. But the biggest thing now is how do you cut through the noise of all the projects that are released every day?
Those payolas still exist?
I was catching myself. I had a moment. I was catching myself. But yes, absolutely. Absolutely it does.
Has it changed in terms of what is being offered to break a song? Because if I'm an artist and I'm listening to the radio and they're playing my song every hour, at least every 90 minutes, what inducements are these record labels offering? If you play Algebra for every 90 minutes, then we will do X, Y, and Z. I don't want to get you in trouble. I don't want you to.
Well, here's the thing. I worked in terrestrial radio for a while, but I worked for stations that that weren't heavily invested in it. So, I can't say what I saw versus what, I've learned or heard about. Well, it's certainly different now than it has been over the years. It's not a straight, hey, we're going to give you X amount of cash, or we're going to give you a car or whatever to play the song. An artist might be more available for a radio station when they're doing their events and they need an artist to perform of name, type of things. There may be a label or a management group or, a Live Nation who's now representing many artists, may be able to say, hey, we need you to break this artist or we need you to break this song by this new artist. But, we also represent artists C over here, and we can make them available to you. We can bring them to you first before we take them to your competition or whatever. So, it's those types of things that are always in play.
The things that always interest me when I'm talking to individuals who have launched business, individuals who have been exposed to new creatives coming down before they were. And before I say that, I'm going to down this hill. You can disagree if you want. You'll be wrong if you disagree with me. Clarence Avant is the greatest music man to ever live. I will die on that hill.
That's a hill worth dying on. I can understand that. I'm not sure I can completely agree, but if he's not the greatest, he's certainly in the top 2 or 3.
Who is one?
Well, as I said, if he's not the greatest, he's certainly in the, top 2 or 3.
I said that to say, you look back in your archives, you pull out a CD, you pull out a cassette, you pull out an album, and you go, I can't believe I had this first. What 2 or 3 are going to jump to your mind?
Well, it wouldn't be specific CDs because my mind, I forget so much of the music that's come through. But there are like artists that jump out to me. There's an artist by the name of Jay Swiss, a hip hop artist who's absolutely amazing. And I've been able to follow his career, the person who's performed shows with me since he first came out of college and came back to New York, and to see where he is now and still climbing. He is amazing. Somebody like a Steve Wallace, an incredible producer. If you have Amazon Prime and you've ever been able to see a movie called Hal King, that is a movie that Steve Wallace produced, did all the music for. It is a musical based on I think it's King Henry, set in like modern times, and it's amazing. He's also a full opera singer and has created his own operas. So somebody like that, somebody like a Maya Azucena, she was one of the first when I started shifting with my radio show into doing independent music and featuring independent artists. She was one of the first independent artists that I played, and to see how much she does worldwide, internationally, as well as here in the States, and more internationally than in the States a lot of times. And let's see, who else? Kimberly Nicole. Many people may remember seeing her on The Voice. She has been amazing. She was one of the first performances she did in New York when she came here was with me. Certainly one of the first interviews she did on New York radio was with me. And to see how amazing she is in doing regular shows in Europe, and just had Usher during his European tour come in and be a part of her show. Her singing with Usher is amazing to be able to watch. So there are people more so than like, that CD. Now, once I think about it, there'll be CDs that'll be like, I have to look through here and be like, I remember this CD.
Do you fall out of love with an artist if they become too mainstream?
I had this conversation with somebody a while back, and I don't think I do. I think it becomes, like I was talking about all these artists that I love, that I've been able to feel like I'm a part of their journey. I think it becomes more I'm a part of their journey than I fall out of love because now they're mainstream. I don't think there's anybody yet that I could say is that mainstream. Even like when I first started playing Eric, he was still, top of the heap then, and he's just gotten bigger. So I don't think there's anybody that has gotten to the point where I could stay they're too mainstream. I guess even somebody like an Anthony David who performed with me one of the first editions of the Rendezvous I did, he performed as a guest and then came back and performed on his own. And then a few years later was named on the playlist of Michelle Obama. So those types of things is, I guess, is kind of like validation, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I think when you think about your process, finding artists and discovering them and helping them and watching them mature, it's always interesting to go back and look and say, okay, this person surprised me. This person's career surprised me because I did not see this, or I was expecting more from this artist than what it is that I received. There are artists that we all love. I mean, as I said about Clarence Avant, I think Rasan Patterson is one of the best entertainers. It's just the fact that he doesn't get more love than he gets is just mind-boggling to me. And his first album, I Will Again Die on That Hill, that was probably one of the best debut albums ever for an artist.
I can go with that.
So I know that Lynn has a question that she likes to ask all of her guests. I'll be quiet and let her ask the important question.
I do want to spend a little bit of time because we talk a little bit about some of the events that are coming up for you. And I want to know if you would share a little bit about that.
So every year we do an event that this will be, I think, year. We do an event that pays a little bit of tribute to our musical history. It's called our Soul Train Tribute, and it was created to pay tribute to Soul Train and the legacy of such, created by Don Cornelius, of course, and pay tribute to him, but also to celebrate some of the musical legends or foundation artists, as I call them, that have appeared on or been connected with Soul Train. So each year there's a Soul Train tribute to a particular artist. And then we have independent artists come and perform a concert that celebrates the music of that artist. So we've done Soul Train tribute to Stevie Wonder. We've done Soul Train tribute to Prince, to Michael Jackson, to James Brown, to music of the movement that features songs from Aretha Franklin and Al Green and stuff like that. Last year, our Soul Train tribute was to Luther Vandross. And I should mention each event is kind of like multi-pronged. So, we have a tribute concert to the artist. We have a film that we show that the artist is either featured in or is about the artist. So last year, the film was with Luther Vandross' documentary coming out. We were able to premiere that documentary in Harlem. Never too much. And Luther is, though he's not from Harlem, we all kind of embrace him as being from Harlem, because he was in Harlem all the time and spent so much of his career is identified in Harlem. And I say all that to say, so this year coming up August 28th, we have our Soul Train tribute concert. This year, we're doing a special thing where the featured film is We Want the Funk. It's celebrating Firelight Media's 25th anniversary. So, Nelson George and others who are involved in the film will be with us so we can do a Q&A with them. And then with the tribute concert portion is going to be a tribute to Sly Stone, who was featured in the film. And of course, we lost Sly just recently. So that's one of the major events that we have coming up. I also work with other entities, artists, and co-producing events. So I'll be co-producing an event in Martha's Vineyard Jazz and Blues Summerfest, which is actually Labor Day weekend. So immediately after the Soul Train tribute, run up to Martha's Vineyard and do that. I am involved. We talked earlier about music conferences and the lack thereof. There is a newer music conference that I'm pleased to be a media partner of. And Rhythm and Soul Radio being a media partner of, called NOLA MusicCon. It takes place in New Orleans, October 28th through the 30th. And so we are there. We broadcast live for all 3 days. And then we also produce one of the evening events, NOLA MusicCon After Dark, where we feature artists mainly in New Orleans. New Orleans is such an incredible city with its history, with its music. Of course, its food is great as well. So NOLA MusicCon is a great conference that kind of brings the different elements of music together, and lots of lots of great sessions and panel discussions on different areas of the business of music. And then there's also the evening of showcasing music and artists from in and around New Orleans, but also showcasing music out of Memphis and out of places out of Texas and, that sort of thing. So that's coming up in October. And then there'll be some other things that'll be, dropped in there September, October, and then coming back in March. And hopefully we'll be back in Austin for South by Southwest.
So hopefully we'll see you. And if anybody's in any of those venues, make sure you check it out. In the show notes, I'm going to drop in your radio station so they can go ahead and follow. Marko, we appreciate you spending this time with us. I know that John really had a good time doing his name dropping. He loves that so much. We're thankful we were able to give him the space for that. John, thank you so much. I thank both of you for being here with me today and letting me listen in to this fascinating conversation. So with that, John, did you have any last minute things that you'd like to say?
Marko, I'm honored to have had some time to speak with you and talk and obviously learn about your journey. And I do wish you well. And if I can support you in any way, let me know.
Appreciate that. Thank you both for having me on. And it's been a pleasure talking to you guys. And hopefully we can do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Stay safe.
This is the annual Soul Train Tribute. This year, our Soul Train Tribute is to the one and only Luther Vandross.
Don't you know that I love you so? Yeah.
I think many of us have adopted Luther as an official Harlemite.
We were here in Harlem on 125th Street almost every single day.
From the Bronx, New York, Mr. Luther Vandross.